So everyone, as you can see, I am stuck in this Russian submarine, as I talked about before. This is from a bar I'm from Boston, so bar, from Cartagena, Colombia, that had a Russian bar. It still probably does, and it's shaped like a submarine. So I'm still stuck in it. So I took this photo. It might be on the quiz. So anyways, and I will be drinking Russian vodka throughout this whole entire lecture. So obviously, the Ukraine is a big, big issue. So we're going to try to apply some of this theory to it, as well as other places. So the first thing, if you don't know about realism when you're reading that book chapter that I posted, you can go back in the other video and watch the regular more basic stuff about international relations theory. But in a nutshell, defensive realism just stresses kind of a security maximization, that in a state world of anarchy, there's no 911 to call. You basically have to maximize your security through allies, defense, etc. Offensive realism is more of an expansionist idea Mearsheimer, opposed to Waltz, talks about. So for him, states expand. And it's not just about the United States, say, expanding in Latin America, Monroe Doctrine, which we're going to get into and other things. But the idea is states expand in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Now you see the Russia in the Ukraine. States just don't try to defend its territory, right? So if you look at the Monroe Doctrine, which is extremely important for U.S. foreign policy, it was basically stating that this area, Latin America, is in our sphere of influence, just like Russia would say, Eastern Europe is in our sphere of influence. So you're not allowed another powerful state to come there. For the offensive realists, they're not just looking at kind of security. You want those buffer zones. That's why Russia wanted Eastern Europe to be all puppets. We want Latin America to be all puppets, right? Because we want to be kind of isolated from any kind of other powers encroaching on our sphere of influence. But offensive realists basically say, which is Mearsheimer, that states expand. They're not just security maximizations. They basically expand for resources and other reasons. And sometimes there's overexpansion in this, which you see in the case of the United States and Iraq, Afghanistan, far away from our own sphere of influence. But you also see that kind of expansion with other states, Vietnam and Cambodia. People forget after they kicked us out, Vietnam did an incredibly good job at when we get into insurgencies. But also then it went into Cambodia, expanded there, this is our sphere of influence, and kind of kicked out Pol Pot, who we forget we supported regardless of that genocide, and kicked out Pol Pot and put it in its own Vietnamese type of puppet government. So this is something that's very, very important to kind of understand. And states expand. And Ukraine, the invasion by Russia, now Russia is seen, we want to go farther into Eastern Europe, possibly. So this is the idea. So for Mearsheimer, states expand, and they have security reasons for this, as well as resources, etc. But this is one of the things Mearsheimer talks about with the Ukraine. He kind of attributes Russian invasion to U.S. policy of expanding NATO, which was threatening to Russia. Now, do you have to believe that or not? That depends on you. But the idea is, would the United States like Russia, Iran, etc., in Mexico? No. So Russia doesn't like the U.S. expanding in the Ukraine. Don't forget that, it was John McCain, the former senator of Arizona, was in the Ukraine, supporting the new presidents after there was a coup. I think it was called the Orange Revolution, and that disposed of a pro-Moscow government. We wouldn't want the same thing in our sphere of influence. So we might expand into other areas in order to make sure that doesn't happen. I think it's the same thing with Russia. So Mearsheimer stresses that, Putin, it's not like he's a Putin apologist or anything like this, but states expand. They have these security interests, economic interests, etc. So they expand. And we have to understand that in U.S. foreign policy, because China is the same way. China, and that's why I give that article, is China a bigger threat, conventionally speaking, not the Chinese people, but as a state, in a state world, a bigger threat? I mean, China is expanding, right? It's expanding throughout the South Chinese Sea, for example, building islands, and then those islands give it more nautical mileage out into the ocean. And then China has more area that it can expand, and then it will have naval bases, etc. And this is attributable to what offensive realists say about expansionism. They're not just securing their or maximizing their security, they're actually expanding. They're offensive. They're going out there. They're just not defensive. So this is two important theories for international foreign policy, because if you think about it, if states do expand, the offensive realists are right, you have to prepare for that. And there's also this idea of primacy. This is exactly interesting because we lived after the fall of the Berlin Wall in a unipolar world, which was basically just the United States being the sole power. Now there's an article I give, and I'm going to give it for a long time, where Putin argues that the end of this unipolar world is over. The end is over. I mean, the unipolar world is over, and now we basically have a more multipolar world. Is this true? Is basically, like Christopher Lane talks about, is there a decline in U.S. power throughout the world vis-a-vis other powers, from Iran, Russia, China, etc. And these states are expanding. So, Robert Gilpin earlier would say this is attributable to the trickle-down effect to technology. Like the United States after World War II, and then after the Cold War, was the rising power of technology, but then that technology spreads, and then other powers have nuclear weapons, economic, technological power, etc., and they become peer competitors. They might not be the competitor like Iran, but it challenges the United States at a regional level, like it has supporting the Houthi rebellion in Yemen. So the idea in U.S. foreign policy, did we lose primacy, right? And do we live in a more multipolar world, meaning these countries now are challenging the United States? And that's why it's interesting to say, is China saying to itself, we are a competitor of the United States, Taiwan is ours, right? And we will take over Taiwan. Has the invasion of the Ukraine galvanized China to say, hey, we're going to take over Taiwan? Or has it done the opposite, saying, look at the resistance in the Ukraine, so we're nervous about going into Taiwan? But I was reading a very interesting article on an expert on China, where they're saying that a lot of the policy is kind of a very patient policy of China to kind of maybe surround Taiwan, strangle it, and make it a weaker power vis-a-vis other, states, and then later kind of take over it, because the Chinese government is very patient with these things. It doesn't usually, quote unquote, invade, like, say, what's going on with Russia in the Ukraine, the United States in Afghanistan and Iraq, etc. So this is very, very important to ask, did we lose our primacy, and will more states challenge the United States? So I want to stress that is basically the question of primacy. Liberal institutionalism is or internationalism, whatever you say, very important for U.S. foreign policy theory, because these people who adhere to this say the United States should act not unilaterally, like a lot of people saw in the Iraq war and Afghanistan, although we did have powers with us, but more through the United Nations, which rejected the war in Iraq, more with NATO, like, say, for example, there's an attack on Russia, or we go in and do something, try to curb or at least weaken the offensive of Russia in the Ukraine. Should the United States do it alone or through NATO? Liberal institutionalists or internationalists think that these organizations are very important, but not just for security reasons, which U.S. foreign policy is not just about security, but like environmental initiatives. Like a lot of people really, bemoan the fact that Bush got us out of the Kyoto Agreement when he didn't really put up forward anything else, and that we need in order to deal with environmental problems, because in the environment isn't necessarily a state entity, meaning that if there's pollution in Mexico or there's pollution in the United States, that pollution will trickle into a neighboring country vis-a-vis Mexico or the United States being next to each other. And it doesn't need a passport to travel. The same thing with water resources, etc. Pollution of water, we could go on and on. Dams, will we face water wars in the future, even within the United States? So liberal internationalists say we need to use international organizations. That's why, even though some have been incredulous about the role of the WHO, the World Health Organization, we still need it, these liberal internationalists would say. Or do you think we should pull out of the WHO because of its failure dealing with the COVID crisis? For the liberal internationalists, they're like, no, we definitely still need an organization. It's not perfect, but that's what we have to deal with some of these crises. Another theory is offshore balancing. That's a very interesting theory because it presupposes that the United States, it's kind of breaks off from offensive realism. The United States is expanding itself too much. Why are we in Afghanistan, Iraq, which a lot of these more offensive realists were against? One, they were against getting rid of Saddam Hussein, who they saw as a buffer to Iran. Once you remove Saddam Hussein, Iran expanded. That's where we killed the Iranian general like never before. There was no way. They fought themselves to a stalemate in the 70s, 80s. And basically Saddam Hussein was a good buffer to Iran. And for me personally, Iran was the biggest winner of the Iraq war because never in its history did it expand into Iraq. In fact, it was the opposite. When Saddam Hussein was trying to fight Iran, the government of Iraq tried to get the Sunnis of Iran to not fight, but they said, we're Iranian first and we will fight you. Now with the Shia government in Iraq, because it's majority Shia, the Iranian Shias have had more influence in Iraq. So by going into Iraq, removing Saddam Hussein, this was a titanic problem because it basically removed the buffer from Iran that was containing Iran. So you look at the logic of these foreign policy theories that offensive realism was saying, and then you get into offshore balancing. Because we expand so much, that creates this hatred, bad policies like the one in Iraq that I just stressed. And they think we need to buttress and support regional actors that are in our interest, like Japan, in Asia. So instead of us dealing always with North Korea and China, we have to allow Japan to have a military, allow it to beef it up, and then have Japan defend itself and other countries within the region, opposed to having the United States with bases everywhere throughout Asia. So, and this is one of the things Obama thought was like, Vietnam is a tough power. I mean, they fought the Chinese, they kicked us out, they kicked out Pol Pot, they invaded Cambodia. I mean, they're tough. Obama administration basically lifted the arms embargo against Vietnam in order for a buffer for China. So what the offshore balancers are saying, we need balancers out there to kind of balance, say, China, use Vietnam, use Japan, get friends in Latin America so we don't have to always invade in Latin America, get friends in the Middle East like Saudi Arabia to kind of balance Iran so we don't have to deal with them as much. And our expansion, that is from the United States, is very, very toxic to a lot of countries and creates hatred and what might be called blowback. Blowback is essentially the idea that the expansion of the United States has created a blowback against our foreign policy, and people don't like us. Basically, a good example is the Iraq War, the first one, where we pushed Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, although it was a strategic success. Putting like 500,000 troops into Saudi Arabia kind of galvanized the more anti-US sentiment and really created credibility for Osama bin Laden. So the idea of blowback is that U.S. foreign policy often creates blowback. And I would believe that this does. In one case where I lived, if you've had me before, Nicaragua, 8 years of my life, that's the poorest country in Latin America after Haiti, by supporting the brutal Somoza dynasty in Nicaragua, we had a revolution in 1979 that overthrew the Somoza dynasty, created blowback, and they became very, not hostile to people from the United States. I never faced hostility in Nicaragua, but hostile to our government and its interests. They actually had a hymn, Yankee enemigo de humanidad, Yankee enemy of humanity, sung by Carlos Mejia Godoy, who's a great singer. But you see that during the 1980s, that was their hymn because the United States was supporting a brutal dictator. And we do support a lot of brutal dictators out there. And when they're overthrown, that can create blowback. You saw it in Cuba. We were supporting Batista and other horrible governments and the Platt Amendment and things in Cuba. And by the time Castro overthrew Batista, there was a very large anti-US, anti-mafia sentiment in Cuba. And then when Castro went to meet Eisenhower, he ended up with just, tricky Dick Nixon. And he said, I just get the vice president. This is terrible. I just had a revolution in Cuba. So that kind of helped create hostile conditions against the United States and Cuba. And basically, we tried to invade a number of times Cuba. Operation Mongoose, which a lot of people don't know, by Kennedy's brother, was trying to hatch a plan to kill Castro. How many times did we try to kill him? So we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. Castro said, basically, if the United States is going to try to invade us, we're going to bring in the Soviet Union. A lot of people might consider this blowback. In fact, when I lived in Nicaragua, even though the people loved the United States, they went there, they went to Miami a lot and stuff like that. So many of my students during 9/11 said, well, we don't want innocent people to die, but you got what you deserved. You're always supporting invasions. We invaded Nicaragua. A lot of people forget. Nicaragua took us to the International Court of Justice. And we essentially, said we don't support the ruling, which ruled against us in the 1980s. We were supporting terrorism and a horrific ragtag group of Contra. You're going to read about the Iran-Contra affair. In fact, from a funny thing, Family Guy, you're going to see that, that were basically terrorists. So that created, in my opinion, blowback. And a lot of people forget that 9/11 happened when we helped overthrow the democratically elected government of Allende in Chile, and Pinochet took over a brutal, government that actually people forget. And we supported the Pinochet government in Chile that committed an act of terror in Washington, D.C. And that is, they killed, Pinochet personally gave the order to kill in Washington, D.C., our capital, the ex-economic advisor to Allende, President of Allende, who we helped overthrow in Washington, D.C., and they blew him up in a car bomb. I mean, that's absolutely amazing that we supported a government that committed an act of terror in our own country, terrorism, because they killed an innocent economic advisor. So, and this is by the CIA as well. I'll put something out there so you can read it. This isn't some kind of, lefty blog of the Huffington Post. This is, the CIA came out and attributed this killing to Pinochet. And it is true that he did do this killing. So this, a lot of people might consider blowback. It's like, we supported the brutal takeover of Pinochet in Allende, I want to say 72, 73. I wasn't around back then, even though a lot of people think I'm older. Oh, probably think I'm younger. But, this is kind of blowback. It's like a lot of, when I lived in Latin America, they were like, look at, you've been doing this stuff for years, committing atrocities, particularly in Latin America, which we could go on and on and on. So does blowback matter? And should we have, according to the offshore balancers, allow our friends in other regions like Japan, that's pretty stable, to beef up, or Germany in Europe? And this offshore balancing became very popular when the United States, through NATO, had to go in and start bombing the former Yugoslavia, which was not popular in Russia, because the European Union, the EC at the time, could not do what it had to do, and that is to basically deal with the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. So, and we could even talk about this now. Should the United States even be involved in the Ukraine-Russia, conundrum, the conflict, or should this be strictly a European Union problem, meaning we shouldn't be spending money on it? And that's something, or even have a gas, or even have sanctions against Russia, particularly with the problems with inflation, etc. I can't believe I'm spending over $5 to fill up my tank. Luckily, I have a Ford Fiesta hatchback. So, but anyways, but these are real problems for U.S. foreign policy. So an offshore balancer might suggest this is a European Union problem, not the United States. And that's something for you to think about. So these are all things, like, I'm not saying my opinion is one or the other, but these are how the theories see it. So one of the things, and if you notice in my classes, theory isn't just some pie in the sky theory, theoretical claim. These theories have policy prescriptions. So think in the quizzes, I will ask, how would someone who thinks like a liberal institutionalist, internationalist think? How do the offensive realists think? How do the offshore balancers? What about someone who fears blowback? Right? What about, someone who talks about, the decline of the United States? We just talked about Christopher Lane is a big one vis-a-vis other powers. What about, for example, a big theory, I like the open door approach. If you look at the open door approach, right, you look at my article on Colombia, which I give in a few classes, that's based on the open door approach, because the open door approach focuses more on economics. So like, why did we invade Iraq? The reason we invade Iraq, mainly because of oil. So we invade a country like Iraq because it has oil, opposed to, say, Rwanda, that doesn't have any real resources we care about. So when there was genocide with the Hutus and the Tutsis, no one really cared, unfortunately, lamentably, because it didn't have the resources. So that's more the open door approach. So you have this list of theories. So let me just conclude by saying you have these theories, defensive realists, security maximizers, offensive realists, more expansionist states for different reasons, economic, security, etc. But we expand as states, right? So Russia probably won't end in the Ukraine. It wants Moldova, etc. The other thing is, right, the idea of primacy. Is the United States losing its edge vis-a-vis other powers? Are we in decline? These are very important things, because if we're in decline, then we have to start thinking about other things. And should we be focusing more on our own economic development opposed to, say, helping the Ukrainians out? These are all things. Liberal internationalists using international institutions, the WHO, the United Nations, etc., NATO, not going it alone is a good thing. Offshore balancing, beefing up other powers, right? Get Brazil on our side, have them deal with all the problems in South America, or Colombia, or something like that. Get Japan, beef up Germany, the European Union, so we don't have to do these things. We should not have bombed the former Yugoslavia. That should have been a European Union problem at the time, called the EC, European Community, or right now, even the Ukraine. We need states to kind of, lead the way. And I do think, there is Obama, Bush, people who talked about it, Trump made a bigger deal about it, but are the European countries paying enough for NATO? Should they be paying more? And that's something like the offshore balances have, stress the fact that these countries should be paying more, right, for NATO. And that's very, very important. The other thing is, if you think about it, what are the role of blowback, right? If we expand, is there blowback? Some bin Laden even said, we want the United States to expand, because then that, gives me credibility, etc. Or is economics one of the lead players in foreign policy? You see that with the Plan Colombia, right? You see log rolling all these companies that are supporting, and government agencies that are benefiting economically from Plan Colombia. But it's the same thing with now the Ukraine. So you can take that idea and put it, is like Lockheed Martin log rolling, lobbying the administration of Biden, right, and whoever takes over after Biden, or if Trump won or whatever, to sell weapons or to give weapons to the Ukraine. So these are economic interests in U.S. foreign policy, right? So, and the idea what comes after primacy, which I ask, is very, very important, right? And the idea, you know, blowback, Iran, that's a great video where we supported the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1943. Mossadegh, my Iranian Farsi isn't the best, and that created the hatred. So I'll end that. We have done just like other countries, not just the United States. And when I talk about the United States, a lot of countries invade other countries, right? You know, even smaller countries, and there's a lot of animosity. Nicaragua, Costa Rica, you know, Azerbaijan, Armenia, etc. We could go on and on. So it's not just a United States phenomena. But if you look, when the United States overthrew Mossadegh in Iran and reinstalled the Shah, well, political expression has to go somewhere. So a lot of the mullahs and the mosques ended up becoming politicized. So people would talk about politics and that kind of gave the mullahs, that gave the more fanatical. Now, Islam has many, just like any religion, you know, like a continuum where there are people who nominally, you know, adhere to Islam, and then there's people like Osama bin Laden who's a little crazy. So, you know, but this gave the more fanatical side of Iran credibility. And when they overthrew the Shah in 1979, there was a lot of groups vying for power, just regular students, socialists, capitalists, Democrats, etc. But the religious fanatics were able to take over because the mosque was so politicized during that time. It's kind of like the Catholic Church and Archbishop Romero became politicized during Latin America when we were supporting the death squads of El Salvador. And then you have all these priests becoming kind of liberation theology and stuff like that because they become politicized, right? Because we can't speak politics in our country because there's a brutal dictator. So it goes into religion often. And that's what happened in Iran. So by the time 1979 came up, all these ayatollahs had power. And Ayatollah Khomeini was actually shipped back from France, thank you, France, on the Air France airline, and ended up being able to kind of take over the revolution. But we forget about that we supported the brutal dictator of the Shah for the longest time, and that could have created blowback. And that's a very good video. So I'll end there, and I laid out the theories. I thought clearly, if there's a problem, asking community forum, because that's a great place to ask these questions. And the idea of expansion, China, Russia, etc. You know, now all these state actors expanding and non-state actors expanding. I mean, Al-Qaeda in 9/11, a horrific terrorist attack in New York, and then obviously Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., etc., all these things. So, you know, I mean, not just states, but non-state actors expand. And then you've got the idea of money and foreign policy blowback, liberal institutionalism, primacy, the decline of U.S. power, etc. So thanks for listening, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed my submarine, because I'm in a Russian submarine, but it's from Colombia, actually, ironically. So we'll end there, and if you have any questions, please, please, please ask in community forum, or if it's of a private nature, shoot me an email. Take care, everyone.